Okay, so factoring and greatest common factor. The greatest common factor has both the number and the variable to an exponent in all of the terms. All right, I could do like a two-term one real quick. Let's say I had 6x plus 12. Well, the greatest thing that they have in common there is a 6. So all last chapter we worked on multiplying and distributing, multiplying everything. Factoring is the opposite of that. So now we're going to take that 6 and pull it out to the front and write 6 times x plus 2. So that's what we mean by factoring out. Pull out that thing they have in common. So factoring is the opposite of distributing. If you look at the bottom left, there's an 8x squared plus 6x plus 2. What do they all have in common? Now it has to be in common with all three of them. So it's not going to be 6 and it's not going to be 8. It would be 2. That's the answer they're looking for when they say what's the greatest common factor. If you were to factor it, we should talk about this because something happens with that 2 at the end. It's kind of like saying, what if I divided everything by 2? Maybe that helps you. Because like 8 divided by 2 would be 4. So I pull that 2 out in front and then I write 4x squared. 6 divided by 2 is 3. Leave the x. And then 2 divided by 2, you pull it out and that's 1 left over. So you have to write that 1. So this is factor. The next one is different because now you have like an x to the 5th, an x to the 10th, and an x to the 8th. So they have a bunch of x's in common. Think about it for a minute, what numbers might be in common there and what x's. All right, as far as the x's go, it's 48x to the 5th. That means there's 5 x's. 240x to the 10th, like you could think of it as like 10 x's being written out. And then 72, there would be 8 x's written out, x to the 8th. Well, how many x's do they have in common? They have x to the 5th in common. Now I just have to do the numbers, right? I think like 24 works. And if you divide each number by 24, you get an even answer. You get 2, 10, and 3. So 24 is your greatest common factor there. Now, let's say you decided to pull out a 2x squared out of it. If I wrote 2x squared, parentheses, if I'm pulling out x squared from x to the 3rd, that means there's 1 left over. And then 12 divided by 2 is 6. And then I pull out the x squared and a 2 from there, so I have this, right? But I picked the wrong thing on purpose. Okay, this is actually not the right answer. But what I want you to see is you look at what's inside the parentheses and you say, okay, well, there's a 2 in common with the 6x and the 2. So I'd have to pull that. So you know whether or not you found the greatest common factor if you can pull out more numbers out of that quantity. So like I might have to do it again. And then make this 4x squared. And then 3x plus 1. Maybe try another one. I think that there's a 3 in common with all those numbers. But you see how they're all negatives? Maybe it'll make sense to pull out a negative 3. The greatest common factor will be negative 3. Now, how many x's do they all have in common? Yep, x squared. So I'm going to say that the GCF is 3x squared, negative 3x squared, and I'm going to factor that out of all of the terms. So it comes backwards out. All right, negative 9 divided by negative 3 is positive. I have to write this out first. So in the parentheses, right, positive 3. X to the fourth divided by x squared is 4 minus 2, that's x squared, so that's what goes in there. Now the next term, negative 3 over negative 3 is positive 1. X to the third over x squared. So remember that rule from the last chapter, subtract the exponents. That should just be x to the first. Remember that you don't have to write the 1 exponent or the 1 in front, so that's just x basically. Now factor out the negative 3x squared from the last term. Well, negative 3 over negative 3 is positive 1 again. And then I have x squared divided by x squared. That just becomes 1. So that turns out to be my answer right there. I'm explaining it a lot in a kind of different ways. And it's also like you're reversing what we did last chapter, so sometimes it's hard to think about it first. Oh, did I do it right? Let's see. I think I did. What's the greatest common factor in part C? Think about it for like maybe 30 seconds. Okay, so maybe I'll just do it like without writing everything out. They have a 2 in common. So I'm going to pull a 2 out of everything, and I'm just going to write 2, parentheses. 5x to the fifth, 6 divided by 2, 4 divided by 2. Okay, done. Any questions or comments on the first or second slide? You want me to go back up or something? I don't know. Whatever. In part C, I leave the exponents alone because there's no x in the greatest common factor. The greatest common factor is just a single number. Whereas here, they had an x squared in common. That's why I pull out an exponent out of each term. You know why? Because the 4 doesn't have an x. So that's why there's no x in common in part C. Immediately, the next thing they asked you is to factor by grouping. So I'm going to group terms together based on like what I think they might have something in common. And almost always, it's just going to be basically groups of 2. So like I look at the first 2 terms here, and I do the GCF of that. Uh, 3x. All right, only pull it out of the first 2 terms there that we grouped. So 6x, you pull out a 3x, and you're left with 2. And then negative 3x squared. You take out a 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1. And then x squared over x is x to the first. But remember, we don't write that. Now look at the second 2 terms and group those. All right, what do those have in common? Not the 2, not the x, but they both have a y. So I'm going to factor out a positive y. Okay, you got to put that sign there.
Because it's plus 2, I'm factoring in positive obviously.
Yeah, right. Another key thing, the terms in parentheses need to match. All right, so now factor again. The reason why those things need to match up is now blue and red makes purple, right? Like art class. You're trying to put things together, like you have to factor twice. So factor the red part, factor the blue part, then you got to put them both together. Oh, these things that I come up with. So you see how now it matches up. It's the exact same thing. 2 minus x and 2 minus x. I am now going to factor out that whole thing. And I'm going to write parentheses, 2 minus x, and then look at what is left over, the 3x and the positive y. So that's going to go in parentheses again. Not 4. Okay, that is my answer right there. Two minus x and 3x plus y. The trick of it is you're going to factor twice, right? 2 levels of factoring. I don't know how you want to put it. Okay. 4x to the third minus 12x squared. What do they have in common? I think I see a 4 in both of them. And I also see an x squared in both of them. That leaves me with x minus 3. I gave you a little hint there. You will factor out a 1. see how there's nothing in common there? It might still factor because we can factor out a 1. Yeah, exactly. So if you want to think of it like this, there's a 1 in front, right? And I got to get the two terms to match up, so I can factor out a positive 1, and that still leaves me with, in parentheses, x minus 3. So they do get kind of tricky. But now at least I'm in the same spot, right? Now your second level of factoring. Put the x minus 3 in front. We're left with 4x squared plus 1. So that whole thing comes out. Moving on. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do both of these now, right? Because this now has two different variables. There's only one thing that the first two terms have in common. The x, right? If I take out an x, I'm left with 3y plus 4. All right, another trick, right? Just kind of throw these things at you. You see how it almost matches? Except the sign's different. So I'm going to factor out a 1, but I will factor out a negative 1. Because I know that if I can factor out a negative 1, that negative 4 will turn to plus. Notice how I have to write that minus. And so if I factor out a negative 1, it becomes positive 3y and positive 4. And now I have my match. By the way, order doesn't matter. I could write x minus 1 first and 3y plus 4 second. They will mix the rules together. You have to be able to tell that all 4 of these have a number in common. That has to come first. It's going to be really exciting. It's like a puzzle to me. You're solving a puzzle. I sense my excitement is not really shared. So now I see like, all right, a green. They have a 4 in common. So now factor out a 4. Right, it took a 4 from everything, right? Now go back to the grouping. Okay, take a look at this. We'll try and color code it. All right, so this has a x in common. On the right side, it has a y in common. All right, oh, see, the whole thing's happening with the 4 in the front. Now I have this. So factor again. So I'm going to write 4, and then parentheses again, 2x minus 1, parentheses x plus y, green parentheses. Three levels of factoring. Okay, I won. I'm a winner.